Hi, my name is Adam Max, and welcome to Nostalgia Obscura. While there's a lot of debate around the validity of this idea, I firmly believe that video games can be art. Their visuals, their writing, even their gameplay can all have something meaningful to say that holds artistic value, and some of the greatest examples of these came from the rise of indie games. Unconstrained by investors and large publishers hyper-focused on making a minimum viable product that appeals to broad demographics, several indie studios have managed to create well-designed interactive experiences that stand on their own as artistic masterpieces. But not all indie games are created or received equally. There are some that are so determined to make an artistic statement that they fail to craft an experience that's compelling for players. These titles tend to suffer critically, especially if they are charging money. Today, we are going to look at one such title. When I first discovered Steam in 2012, I found myself enamored by the options that lay before me. So many games were within reach of my fingertips, and so many of them were so cheap. The frequency of flash sales that absolutely slashed the base prices turned me into a frequent shopper on the digital storefront. This was back when Steam was still considered a purveyor of quality goods with extremely high standards instead of the sluice gate of garbage that it is today. Given this reputation and the fact that user reviews didn't exist yet, I ended up buying a lot of games on a whim simply because they looked interesting without having any other information. And that was how I ended up buying Dinner Date, the first and only title by Dutch developer Stout Games, on sale for $1.04. In retrospect, I probably should have read some of the warning signs before I bought this game. All of the cropped screenshots on Dinner Date's Steam page showed a first-person perspective, and little bubbles were floating around in front of the camera with different letters in them, which looked interesting. But all of these screenshots appeared to be in the exact same location. I figured at the time that there was something else about this game that I was missing. There had to be. I knew the game was cheap at a base price of $2.99, but surely there had to be more content to this experience than what I was seeing. The trailer should have been a dead giveaway, with much of it being dedicated to a lot of really nice presentation, but not a lot of gameplay. And what little gameplay it did show didn't make very clear what the player was actually supposed to do.
Shit, she is late. Might have just missed a bus, of course.
It's worth noting, by the way, that this trailer is no longer on Steam. I actually had to pull this from what seems to be the official YouTube channel for Stout Games. 20 subscribers. Well, they've still got more than me. Comments are turned off, but it's unclear if the video had this setting before or after its upload date, nearly 10 years ago. Then there's the way this game is marketed. In the trailer, the store description, and even the official banner artwork, there's a variation on the phrase, "Become the subconsciousness of Julian Luxemburg." What does that mean? Stout Games plasters this statement all over their game as though anyone who'd read it would automatically know what they are trying to say. What does it mean to become someone's subconscious? That tagline is kind of nonsense, right? Or is it just me? Something I'm not getting. I went to the About This Game section on the store page to see if it offered me some clarity, and it kind of did. Julian Luxemburg has prepared a dinner for two at his place, but things go awry when the date does not show up and he is left waiting at the dinner table, the clock's ticking growing unbearably loud. Dinner Date is the character portrait of Julian. By becoming his subconsciousness, you gain a clear vantage point on the worries which take a hold of him. As the wait for the beautiful girl grows longer, it becomes evident that Julian's real problems may not even begin to originate the girl. What of his work and his boss? And what of the headhunter, his fascination with Byron, and his friendship with Jerry, who, all things considered, was ultimately the person who pushed Julian to go on this date? You are not merely listening. In the unprecedented role as his subconsciousness, you tap the table, look at the clock, and, as Julian bears more of his mind, reluctantly start to eat, your actions resonating with Julian's thoughts to form an absolutely singular form of intimacy. In this manner, you will experience Dinner Date, with some glasses of wine, some bread, some soup, and with a clock which slowly mocks the constant wait for when she comes, this elusive girl who will solve everything. Okay, so that was a lot of information that mostly means nothing when devoid of context, but buried in this block of text are a few lines describing what things you can do in-game. Nowadays, even without the presence of Steam reviews, this kind of game, the kind that only vaguely describes what it is, will be one that I'd thoroughly research before buying, even if it's cheap. But back then, I decided to let curiosity overcome doubt and give Dinner Date a try. And what followed was an experience that I found fascinating in spite of how uneventful it was. After taking about 10 seconds to install the game, followed by creating a profile for myself, the game brought me to its main menu, and the presentation is kinda nice. You get a view of the clock and dinner table with myriad random objects littered about. In the background, you can hear someone preparing dinner and moving from one task to another. Washing dishes, eating chips, cutting vegetables. The sound design here really does make you feel like someone is moving around, doing things behind the camera in lieu of actually having to animate a character model. It is a little strange though that on your very first playthrough you can choose Select a Chapter. Does Stout Games want their players to skip around the first time playing? Anyway, once you begin, you get a little tutorial that fleshes out the game's mechanics. Those bubbles that appear on screen represent different actions with keys that correspond to them. Simple enough, but what's more interesting is the text in the upper left, which reveals one of the most telling things about this game. The fact that you are not the main character, and therefore have no control over any of the choices he makes. Already, this signals a problem, since fundamental gameplay for any game revolves around the player making choices. This is not to say that all games need to be like RPGs, but that even the most linear of games need to give players a degree of agency. Otherwise, they'd be hardly different from movies.
Choice. It's the best part of being a real person.
We then fade into our main scene, looking through the eyes of Julian in his kitchen/dining room, sitting and waiting patiently for his date to show up. The bubbles float about, and pressing each prompted key initiates either a camera movement, an animation, or both. While you do this, Julian talks to himself, though it's somewhat unclear if he's doing it aloud or in his head.
Those slender legs. See her cry out with joy.
He talks,
Why he doesn't just fire Marianne and himself.
and talks,
I'm getting quite hungry. Did I even lunch? Can't remember what I've had for lunch.
and talks,
God knows the Japanese can't hold their liquor.
and never stops.
Well, fuck Jerry.
There are hardly any moments of silence in this game. It just keeps demanding that the main character fill any gaps in dialogue with more dialogue. And although it's supposed to inform the player of the game's narrative background, it too feels extremely inconsequential because nothing that Julian mentions comes into play during the game itself. Remember that long blurb in the store description that mentioned Julian's various issues and name drops several people as though they will get more fleshed out in the game itself? Well, that development doesn't really happen. Julian will mention them offhandedly during his monologue, usually accompanied by some generic complaint or insult, but other than this, these off-screen people get no characterization.
And what does Johnson do these days? Just sits at his desk fiddling his iPhone and having trivial conversations with the clients I get for him. Oh yes, he does all the lunches, it's a business expense.
So this means that while playing, you can tune out whatever Julian is saying and you basically get the same exact experience from beginning to end. Not counting the introductory tutorial, this game has 4 very short chapters, each revolving around a different focus of Julian's. You transition between them by having a bubble prompt you to drink wine once Julian has run out of dialogue. The first 3 are unfortunately all in the same place, sitting at the table, while the 4th moves to the window and then briefly to the front door. I guess technically there was more to this game environment than the screenshots implied, but it wasn't much more. And that's not to mention the fact that 3/4 of the game is spent at this table, with only the last chapter exploring the space further. So if we're stuck staring at this relatively small and claustrophobic space, I'd hope it's at least nice to look at. And honestly, it doesn't look that bad. I mean, it's nothing special, the models are pretty obviously lower poly with generic textures, but they're all competent and I can tell what each model is supposed to be. Considering that this game seems to be the work of one person, I can give it a pass for looking a bit subpar. I get it, 3D modeling is hard, especially when you have to do it alone. The only models I didn't like were the ones that were animated, namely Julian's arms and hands. Like the rest of the models, these are lower poly, but because they move, they end up looking angular and unnatural. This weird look is compounded by the hand's texture, being extremely pale and having gray looking nails. Ugh. They also suffer from clipping issues during several animations, whether they're with the camera, other models, or themselves. It's rather off-putting. The only thing that doesn't look good are, look at his fingers. Look at the way they're bending. Oh my god. That's, you could see the polygons like folding into themselves. Alright, I'm gonna move away from that animation. Objects that Julian picks up also have this tendency to slide around, not being completely clamped in place. So you may be wondering at this point, what exactly happens in this game? What events transpire during the playtime of Dinner Date? The answer is nothing. Nothing of real note or interest happens throughout the entire game. You might think I'm being hyperbolic, but this is me being as truthful as possible. Let me break down exactly what little happens in each chapter. Chapter 1, the clock. Julian sits and stares at the clock while waiting for his date to arrive. Chapter 2, the bread. Julian sits and eats bread while waiting for his date to arrive. Chapter 3, the soup. Julian sits and eats soup while waiting for his date to arrive. Chapter 4, the cigarettes. Julian gets up and has a smoke as he fully comes to terms with the fact that he has been stood up. That's pretty much it.
Damn! I can't stand she didn't show up. So much depended on it, didn't it?
And the entire time, there is nothing to do other than press buttons to initiate different subconscious actions and listen to Julian drone. He's feeling understandably upset from being stood up, but this doesn't make him an interesting or sympathetic character. In fact, the constant complaining only makes him seem pathetic and unlikable. I don't fault the voice actor for this problem because he's doing an alright job. It's a fundamental issue with the writing. Plenty of people know the frustration associated with being stood up, so unless you're going to bring to the table something new to say, why make this the subject of your interactive experience? Near the end of the 4th chapter comes what could generously be considered the game's climax. Julian is smoking by his window, reciting Byron to himself, when his doorbell rings.
Here's her streaming hair. The black curls. Oh, fuck giving it up, here she is.
He drunkenly staggers toward it, thinking it's his date, and the screen fades to white as he opens it, I assume because the developer didn't want to animate the door or model a hallway. I actually think it would have been best had the game ended right here, on a note of ambiguity. Not getting the answer as to whether or not Julian's date actually showed up might have been frustrating to some players, but I like endings that leave the players speculating. And it would have been a better ending than what we got. The scene fades back in, and it turns out, surprise, his date wasn't there.
Fucking neighbors. Damn.
At that point, he decides he wants to go out and meet his friends, so he puts out his cig and grabs his coat. The camera then detaches itself from Julian and floats around the scene as the lights go out, and Julian is implied to leave through the medium of sound. Once again, this is probably a practical choice to avoid additional animation or modeling. And what I suppose is meant to be a bookend, the last shot is of the ticking clock, before fading to the credits. With my entire gameplay experience clocking in at around 20 minutes, Dinner Date was over before it ever really went anywhere. And yet, even with its short length, playing this game feels so incredibly slow. It moves at its own pace and doesn't care about how you want to play it. The only moments where the player has control over the pace of the game are the transitions, and I actually discovered while replaying that if you wait too long, the game just transitions without you. The polygon's breaking out of his skin. Oh, what the? I didn't even press P! See, this is what I mean. I thought initially that you just had to press P in order to advance, but it seems like you don't even have to do that. It just does it for you. Do I have to do anything in this game at all? If I were to sit here and not press any buttons except for, I guess, P whenever he has to drink wine to go to the next stage, then I don't think the gameplay would change at all. I haven't tried that, and I don't think I will, because that's more time than I'm willing to give this game. Despite what I said there, I actually did go replay the game without touching any of the controls to test my hypothesis. Not including the beginning of the tutorial, it turns out that, yes, you can let this game play itself without any input from you. Besides being a bizarre design choice that only allows you to play through the already short experience slightly faster instead of slower, this just proves to me that the primary concern of Stout Games was telling the story that they wanted to tell no matter what, even if that meant sacrificing any kind of player agency in order to do so. This is just baffling, and goes against my personal bare minimum definition of a game, or at the very least an interactive experience. It begs an obvious question: why would anyone willingly pay for this game if you can essentially get the same experience for free from watching a 20-minute Let's Play on YouTube? None of this is to say that there isn't room for this kind of software at all. Experimental projects should be encouraged because they have the potential to grow into great things. But they should also have an awareness of where their place is. The sad fact is, if this is the completed state of Dinner Date, then it does not belong on Steam and certainly should not be charging money. And yes, I know that may seem like small potatoes when compared to the torrent of asset flips, scams, and incomplete games that infest Steam now, but I don't want to hold Dinner Date to those standards. It came out during a time when getting onto Steam as an indie was considered prestigious, and therefore its quality should also be up to par. I hate using the word pretentious, but much of Dinner Date feels like thinly veiled pretentious drivel, and the level of work put into it matches that of a game design student's capstone project at best. The kind that should be free on itch.io, not for sale on Steam. It makes me wonder how this project even got on Steam when it did in the first place.
Well, fuck Jerry.
Since I spent so much time thinking about criticisms for Dinner Date, I figured I may as well think of ways to improve it as well. For one, much of the story that's described in the store page is borderline useless because none of that is conveyed clearly through the in-game narrative, and Julian's thoughts just come off as rambling nonsense. Is any of this background information necessary, or can it be cut out? As for Julian's story during the game, I think it'd be much more interesting if he didn't come off as the typical struggling 20-something-year-old dude. We're all already familiar with that character, some of us more personally than others. If we have to sit here and listen to him talk, how about making him a little crazy? Maybe he can slowly become more and more unhinged as the story progresses and the girl never shows up. Of course, Julian could also not be constantly talking. I think that Dinner Date really could have used Life is Strange-esque moments of quiet, where the player could just do nothing and listen to the nice music, which is probably the best thing about the game. I'd also offer the player some more freedom of movement. You went to all the trouble of modeling this area, let us see it for ourselves. And even if our actions are limited to Julian's subconscious, it'd still be ideal if some of these actions had an effect on the story, even if it's somewhat understated. And most importantly, please fix the creepy hands! Not much has happened for Stout Games since Dinner Date. After user reviews were introduced on Steam, the game has pretty much been permanently sitting at an overall level of mixed, with negative reviews describing its faults and positive ones being mostly sarcastic praise. The lone developer behind Stout Games, Jeroen D. probably realized at this point that his game sales would be low on Steam, so in 2015 he actually bumped up the base price by $1. He also removed the trailer from the page at some point. In the credits for Dinner Date, I saw a link to Stout Games' official website, which I promptly visited after playing. The site itself is pretty small, but I managed to glean some interesting new info about the one-man studio. The URL redirects to an announcement page for a new game called Cheongsam. Cheongsam? Hold on, let me look this up. Cheongsam pronunciation.
Cheongsam.
Okay, Cheongsam. That's how you say it, Cheongsam. By the looks of it, it's another art game with an extremely vague description of what it actually is. No real surprise there. Pause the video if you'd like to read the whole thing. I just want to highlight part of one sentence that makes me worry that Stout hasn't learned from the Dinner Date experience. Free of achievements or explicit goals, Cheongsam invites you to give your own interpretation to the script. It's abundantly clear that this game is nowhere near finished, seeing as the page has 4 screenshots of the game scattered around it with no trailer to accompany them, only a video that plays a song from the game's soundtrack. There's also no release date, and if you go to the news page, sitting below a small advert for Dinner Date is a single announcement for Cheongsam, posted in February of 2016. There's no other information on the website, so I went to Stout Games' infrequently updated Twitter, and only found 3 tweets announcing the game, all dated the same as the post on the news page. Cheongsam itself also has its own Twitter, for some reason, used like a developer blog to document work progress, which has little attention and mostly consists of Stout making long threads, talking to himself. But this account also hasn't had any activity since September of 2018, which leads me to think that Stout may have abandoned the project but never bothered to officially cancel it. If an online store page could ever have its own director's cut version of itself, then the Dinner Date page on the website would be that to its equivalents on Steam and itch. At the top of the page is an opening sentence that's programmed to change what it says depending on what day or time of day it is, which is actually a nice touch. Most of the description is the same, although the begin originate the girl line was fixed. New sections were also added, including one for languages, a music credit, and even a recommended wine section, as I'm sure all players of Dinner Date would appreciate knowing which wine to drink while playing the game. There's also a clear preference towards the itch.io version of the game, seeing as there are 3 links to that one and only 1 for Steam. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that there are no user reviews on the itch page. The About section is small, having a list of contact links if anyone needs to reach the studio, and a short summary of Jeroen Stout's background. There are links to his personal Twitter, which is far more active than his studio's but given even less attention, and his inactive Tumblr, where he used to post essays about literature and games and responses to other people's essays. There's a lot to learn about Stout from his socials, which paint a clearer picture of the kind of developer who would make something like Dinner Date. Not surprisingly, he often speaks highly of other art games like The Path, 30 Flights of Loving, and especially Dear Esther. In one of his many essays debating the nature of games, he proposes that the word game be replaced with the word fancy as an umbrella term for virtual games. Stout then proceeds to use fancy in several other essays, even using it as his now replacing the word game on Dinner Date's itch page. There's also a link to a designated press page with press kits which I happily downloaded. The one for Cheongsam had the screenshots already seen on its page, along with a document describing the game and its influences, all pretty standard stuff. But the one for Dinner Date, besides having game screenshots and logos, included this photo of Stout. This was the actual picture of himself that he wanted the press to use if they wrote about Dinner Date. I laughed when I first saw it, but honestly this picture didn't surprise me at all. Everything I had learned about Jeroen D. Stout as a person, from his games to his essays to even his tweets, created a clear image in my mind of the kind of developer who would make something like Dinner Date, and this picture embodies that mental image perfectly. Dinner Date is a curious little piece of software created in the burgeoning days of the art game movement, and an experiment which I think ultimately failed. It was unable to connect with what small audience it tried to reach, and only seemed to alienate players, some of whom probably felt cheated by the relatively high entry fee for such a short and shallow experience. And as such, it has been relegated to a middling reputation among the few who know of its existence. Not good enough to be noteworthy, and not bad enough to be ironically entertaining. And while I personally didn't care much for it, I see Dinner Date as a potential learning experience. A lesson about reading your audience, understanding what they expect from you, and being prepared to make sacrifices to your artistic vision in order to create something they can enjoy. Stout Games took a risk with this project, and it didn't end up paying off, so the next best thing they can do is examine why this was, and really take into consideration what they can improve on for their next work, whether that's Cheongsam or something else. There are a lot of people out there who want to see art games fail, but I'm genuinely rooting for Jeroen D. Stout. I hope that he continues creating, because I would love nothing more than to someday play a game of his which I can wholeheartedly say I enjoyed.
It's good bread. And a good tapenade. I'm actually quite good at that. Yeah.